Welcome to Grace Cafe. My name is Mark Rae. I'm Executive Director of the Grace Center for Spiritual Development, and I want to invite you, share this post with your friends. You're in for a real treat this morning as we launch into probably, or what scholars have agreed is the most difficult passage in all the New Testament. My guest today is Dr. Ken Wilson. I want to introduce him. He is well, let me just put it this way. You've got more letters behind your name than the entire alphabet. So you, Ken, we're pulling in the scholarship here. He is a professor of systematic theology and church history at Grace School of Theology. He's got a DPhil from Oxford, his THM from Golden Gate Baptist Seminary, got an MD at UT. You've been a hand surgeon, or you still are a hand surgeon. You're faculty here. You are probably, probably considered today the foremost expert on Augustan. Married, 4 grown kids, and we're just thrilled to have you here. So after that introduction, let me just invite everybody to go get your favorite mug of tea or coffee, grab it, come sit down, because we're going to have a really interesting and hopefully enlightening discussion on this very, very difficult passage, James 2. Ken, welcome. We are so glad you're here, and so glad you're here to talk to us about this particular topic. Welcome.
Thanks, Mark. Happy to be here.
You just shared with me something right before we went on air, and that is that you've got an article on basically, and let me put it into layman's terms because I can't even get the entire title of this article in. It's being published in the Journal of Biblical Literature. It's on James 2 specifically, James 2 verses 18 through 20. And it's the view of how Augustine's approach to that passage is what colors our thinking today about this difficult passage. Did I put that correctly? Did I couch that well?
Yeah, exactly right, Mark. So everything we understand about James 2, how we read it, the context, what good works are, what dead faith is, all those things come right out of Augustan. And I show how his early identity with the Donatists and his conflict with them has shaped that and is problematic because he didn't come to the right conclusions.
Well, so let's start there. Help us with this. Set the stage for us, Ken, if you will. Give us author, give us context, give us audience to this little book. There's so much controversy that swirls around this, and especially when we get into this topic of faith without works is dead faith. We want to get to definitions of all of that as well, but let's frame this out well first. So walk us through, again, author, audience, context. Why is the letter being written? Land us there first, if you will.
Sure. Well, of course, there's disagreement, and scholars, many of them will say that James the Apostle did not write this, but someone later. I hold that it was actually James the Apostle that wrote this book, and he wrote it very early. Most more conservative scholars will say that he wrote it before 50 AD, before the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. So this is before Paul ever wrote anything. We have no Pauline letters, nothing. He is on his first missionary journey. He's out there in the field working, and he hasn't written anything. So you have to understand that this is a very early work, and it's a Jewish work. In fact, some scholars think it's not Christian at all. It's Jewish because it is so Jewish. You look at the Sermon on the Mount and you compare it to this book, and it has, over a dozen different direct identifications with that sermon. Nothing else in the New Testament has that. So if you don't understand this is a very early pre-Pauline and Jewish work, you're going to go wrong. So that's the first place we have to go.
And given that, who's his audience? Who's his audience, and what is? I'm a very strong fan of the fact that there is more than likely a thread of unified thought through each of these letters. What's that thread? So who's the audience, and what's the thread, the main point of the book?
Yeah, so if you look at the very first sentence, it's James, and he's writing to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. So these are dispersed Jews. They've been run out of the land of Israel. They're elsewhere in the Mediterranean, and he's writing to these Jewish Christians. If you look at the book, 15 times he uses the term brothers and beloved brothers. So it is a Christian audience. And if you try to say this is a mixed audience between Christians and non-Christians, that's really an anachronistic mindset. That came in with Augustan when he tried to put, well, they're believers and unbelievers in the church because that happened after Constantine. When Constantine legalized Christianity, all these pagans flooded into the church, and they were no longer being killed for being Christians. It was a benefit to be a Christian. So
Huh.
that's the problem with this modern view of it's a mixed audience, believers and unbelievers. If you just look at the book, 15 times he says, brothers. I don't think any other book does that, Old
Yeah,
Testament or New Testament. It is just
yeah.
filled with the idea we're writing to my fellow Christians who are Jews.
And if you take that further, now you bring in the Pauline letters, you do see Paul uses that language constantly, my brothers, my brothers, my brothers, my
Yep,
brothers. So,
right, right.
so we have context, excuse me, we have audience, we have author writing specifically to these Jewish Christians. What's the overall theme of what he's trying to get to? What's the issue at stake that he's writing the letter, the purpose of the letter?
So if you look at this, it has a lot to do with wisdom literature. The Jews were very much into how to live wisely. How do we get the most out of life? How do we obey God? How do we have intimacy with God? How do we maintain this tight friendship with God? That was their goal. So this is what James is doing. He's not writing on telling them how to get to heaven. Most Protestants read this and Catholics too. How do we get to heaven? No, that's the wrong approach. We're already in with God. What we need to do is figure out how to live rightly with God, how to be a friend of God. And so that's where he's headed in this book.
Well, and that makes sense because he's calling them brothers. These would be ones who
Correct.
are already believers. So to then back up and address salvation would be, it would make no sense in the letter to address salvation if they already have it. Um,
That's correct.
this would almost be Paul and Philippians, work out your salvation. You have this salvation now. How does it play out in your life? That would be the question that they're asking. So what is this salvation? How does this Christ and how does it all fit together so that I live a life pleasing to God? So let's
Right. And
dive
the
into,
words,
yep, go ahead.
uh, so the word save, I mean, if you just take that in the book of James, he uses it 5 times. And twice it clearly means physical salvation, saving the life. And that was the most common meaning for the Jews in the Old Testament. Had nothing to do with going to heaven. It's how to preserve the life. Especially in Proverbs, it says multiple times, and many of them, but righteousness delivers from death. You can save yourself from the snares of death by living rightly. That's the idea.
Great. Okay. Dive in then to chapter 2. We've got audience, we've got context. What is the issue, the main issue that makes this such a difficult passage?
Well, it's Augustine to be blunt, because we read it we read it through his eyes. And I'll just preface that quickly by saying in 400 he was fighting the Donatists, which are another Christian group. And so what he does is he picks up this passage like a big mallet, and he whacks the Donatists with this passage. How does he do that? Well, he takes this passage about demons believe and tremble, and he says, you Donatists are demons. You
Oh,
have faith, but you don't have good works. And therefore, you're not really Christians. So he marginalizes them. He weaponizes James 2 against the Donatists. You are not Christians. Well, why weren't they Christians? Well, they didn't have love. Why didn't they have love? Because they left the one true church, the Catholic Church. So
Uh,
this is the whole issue, and this is where we get the whole idea of non-Christians in here is from Augustan. So if you start from that perspective, you go, oh, okay, well, let's back up and see what the passage is really saying. So that would be my first point on it. So if you
okay,
go
so then,
to, go ahead.
yeah, so back us up, and then let's look at it in the context, if we can, taking an Augustine view out of this. Let's look at it from the context of James is writing to Christians, Jewish Christians, about how to live the Christian life more fully, how to live it to its fullest. Um,
Right.
Walk us. Okay, so we're removing the issue for just a moment, because then I'm going to ask you to put the issue back in. Remove the issue for just a moment and walk us through why now it is not a difficult passage. Does that make sense?
I
Did
think
my
it's
question make
oh
sense?
oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Okay,
So
good.
so if you go to 212 and start there, most people start with 14. Well, wait a minute. The whole thing 14 through 26, it's a sandwich. If you look at 212 and 13 and then you look at 3:1, you find the context. So speak and so do as those who will be judged by the law of liberty. So these are Christians being judged by the law of liberty. For judgment is without mercy to the one who show no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. He's clearly talking about judgment, and it's judgment of the Christian. We believe that's at the Bema, Christ's judgment seat, because we're all going to
Right.
stand there to be judged for the works we've done, whether good or bad, according to Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:10. So you look at 3:1, what does 3:1 say? Well, my brethren, let not many of you become teachers. Why? Knowing that we will receive a stricter judgment. So interestingly, James includes himself. Now, if the apostle didn't make it to heaven, we're all in trouble, you know? And so I don't think that's the context. The
Yeah.
context is him as a Christian standing before God to be judged by his works, as well as all Christians. So if you understand that context and it's about Christian judgment, not whether you're going to heaven or hell, all of a sudden it opens up the passage and you start getting what James is really trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we begin to understand there's a different framework, a different viewpoint for this, and it is a judgment of the works, which now begins to put into play why James is so let me not just say eloquent, but why he's so dogmatic about this is how you not only have full life today, but how you have full life for eternity. This is
Right.
this is why how you live life today matters. Um, so from that perspective, Ken, then define for me, because this is kind of for me, this is kind of a fine tuning point. Define for me dead faith.
Okay. So there are two views on that. Well, there are probably more, but two basic views. One is that dead faith means false faith. That comes from Augustine. If you look at the word nekros, norkao, the verb anywhere in the New Testament, or even the Old Testament, if you go back in the Septuagint, you can't find it means false. Every time it means dead.
Right.
If you look at Abraham, when it talks about his body being dead or Sarah's womb being dead, it wasn't actually false. He didn't have, and I do this to my students. I say, the false in Christ will rise first. I mean, what's wrong with this picture? So
Yeah.
it means if you go to Abraham and Sarah, it means it's useless. I mean, it's not working properly. And that's much different than false. So when he
Yes.
says a dead faith, he means it's worthless. So I say it like this. When you show up at the Bema, you better show up with works or you're in big trouble because the judgment is all about works. It's not about faith. If you didn't have faith, you wouldn't be there.
You wouldn't
So
be
it's
there.
about
Right.
works. So I say it's like showing up to a gunfight with a knife. You're in big trouble. You're not going to win this. You are going to get slaughtered. And that's what's going to happen to Bema. If Christians don't show up there with good works, it's not going to be a happy day. We better
Yeah.
have some good works, not to get into heaven, but in order to be judged by God for what we've done in the body, whether good or bad.
which then lends credence again to the issue of you have this life, and what you do with this life does matter. It also brings to bear that whole issue of the thief on the cross. How could he have gotten into heaven? He didn't have time to do good works. Well, the issue for him is he is going to heaven, but there's not a lifetime of good works that he can attach to it.
That's right. He has
So,
nothing to show.
so uh, let me throw a visual at you and either pump this up or shoot this down. Um, if you're on a beach and you've put this nice fire on the beach, and the fire burns, and eventually the fire begins to die, there's a way to pump new life back into the fire. You throw wood on it, you stoke the embers, you poke it with a stick. The fire is dying to the point that the fire can die. It is no longer a fire. But
Right.
the way to get the fire to re-energize is to, again, throw wood on it, put fuel on it, do the work to bring the
Right.
fire back to life. Is James saying to us, and I loved your definition here, that faith without works becomes useless? The way to pump that faith back up is to engage in good works. And
Exactly.
that's, you talk about living life fully, you live life fully. And I would say across the board, if you're a believer and you're listening to this right now, try the experiment. If you feel your faith lagging, if you feel like you're not as close to God as you can, go out and serve somebody. Go out and do the good works and see what begins to happen to your faith. That seems to be just practically what James is trying to say. And now, in context of what you just said, that begins to make all the sense in the world. Is that a decent visual?
Oh, absolutely, Mark. Because if you look at the last verse of that chapter, whereas the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead also. The works are what actually energize our faith. It gets us going again.
Right.
I compare it to, in your fire analogy, I compare it to, I mean, a medical doctor, corpses. I mean, let's look at this. If you're walking along and you find a dead body there, I mean, you see a corpse, you don't think, oh, this is a false body. Um,
No.
it used to be
Yeah.
alive. I mean, this isn't a fake body. It was alive and now it's dead. So with that analogy, I think it's a little graphic, but yeah, bear with me. That's what he's trying to say. Yes, your faith has to be energized by works. It needs to come
Yes.
alive, just as you said with the fire.
And nowhere in it does James make the impression that if you don't do works, you don't have faith. He's talking to believers who already have faith.
Yep.
And I just, again, putting the context around this, Ken, of here was the issue for them. The issue is, how do I live this full life? The issue is, how do I get closer to God? Well, he just gave them a really, really good way to do that. So throw an Augustinian viewpoint back on this now that begins to pull us off the target of what James' intent was. Can you kind of superimpose that back on this again so we understand that issue?
Yep. Yep. So the classic view, Catholics, Calvinists, Arminians, you keep going, works demonstrate true faith. Works demonstrate true faith. You don't have works, you have false faith. So that's the Augustinian view. What's very interesting, and I pointed this out in this article, that no place in James 2 does James say works demonstrate true faith. Or if you don't have works, you're not a Christian. It's all assumed because of Augustine. You can't find it in the text because that's not what he's saying at all. He's saying you
No.
better have works when you stand at the bema. Not that it's false versus true. So that's the big problem that we see in the passage.
And that, when you think about it, that's a viewpoint that's been held since the 300s. That's a
No,
viewpoint that's been
1600
held
years.
1600 years, for a
Yeah,
long, long,
yeah,
long time. Why do you think that viewpoint has been? Because here's what I'll tell you from my standpoint. Maybe it's just because I walk in this theology and have since I was 14 years old. But in that theology, there's such liberty and such freedom in that theology because it changes it shifts your focus. My focus is now, how do I get closer to God without
Yep.
the fear of in this life, without the fear of I'm going to do something wrong. How do I get closer to God? Why is this a viewpoint that has been held so tightly by so many groups? And certainly, Ken, there have been scholars down through the ages that could have seen something as simple as verses 12 and 13 in chapter 3, verse 1, as the bookends to this argument. Why has this been held for so long?
That's a great question, and I point out that I think it's simply because the prestige of Augustan and habit. People have missed. I talk about in the chapter the whole idea of the demons believe and tremble is not spoken by James. It's spoken by the imaginary objector, the interlocutor. We have just taken that, and the Greek diatribe, there's a very specific way you're supposed to read this in Greek, and there are markers telling you who starts and who stops. And it's all messed up. Scholars know the diatribe, but this theology is so ingrained, they can't bring themselves to admit, oh, wait a minute, it's the objector who says the demons believe and tremble, not the author of James. So
Wow.
there it goes. And I
Wow.
point that out,
Well,
and the editors agreed. They said, we don't know how we missed this. This is incredible. So
well, and you may find we don't know how we missed this, but guess what? We're not going to change our mind. Um,
yeah, well,
we're
that's
gonna
pretty
we're gonna
true.
yeah we're gonna stay with this theological viewpoint. Um,
Right.
and it begs this question, and I know this is a question that we get in our theological camp a lot because we ask this question a lot. If faith without works brings you to a point of dead faith, and you're saying that works are the evidence of faith, what works are those? Who determines what works those are? Which ones are the works that are evidence of faith and which ones aren't? Where's the guideline? Is
Yeah, you pick it. As you know, everybody has their different list, and it's all works based, and it's completely meaningless. You lose any sense of what you're really supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
So I like to point out even the word justified in this passage, we try to make it into a Pauline justification, and it's not that at all. It's an early Jewish, and the early Jewish view was, for if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. People take that. I'm thinking this justification is not Pauline justification declared righteous by faith in Christ. This is a Jewish view of justification, which is being intimate with God. If you
Mm,
look at the tax collector and the Pharisee that Jesus talks about, he says, Lord, be merciful to me, a sinner, as he beats on his chest. Pharisees over there, thank God I'm not like this poor guy. And Jesus said, who went away justified? Well, there was no faith. There was no believing in Christ. It was, what does God want? Micah 6:8, to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. It's a justification. It's a friendship with God. It's an intimacy with God based on doing good things, being righteous. It's not a declared righteous Pauline concept. So if you understand justification from that sense, it makes a huge difference as well.
that takes us all the way back to the garden because God's desire for Adam in the garden was to walk with him,
Right,
to
right.
do rightly because he gave him dominion. Do the work in the garden and walk with me. You know, gee,
Yeah.
do we have a God that actually desires to be with us and actually desires that intimacy? When you begin to couch James 2 into that phraseology, because it definitely has that Jewishness to it, it puts a whole different spin on how
Yeah.
we try, especially given that this letter was written before any of Paul's letters. You don't have that influence over this that we so readily have, uh, because we are so steeped in Pauline theology. That's wow. That's a completely
That's why
different view.
it is, and that's why
That's
it says
fantastic.
he Abraham was called a friend of God. Well,
Right.
you can bring people into your house. They can be in your house, and you don't have to be intimate with them. So this isn't about getting to heaven in the Western Catholic view. It's more the Eastern Orthodox view of an intimacy with God and becoming like Christ. So that's the stand we need to take. This is a friendship with God. It's an intimacy with God in James 2. It's not about getting to heaven at all.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think one of the most significant arguments about is he's already talking to an audience that has already done that. These are these are already believers. So again, why would he go back over old ground that's already been plowed? Um, are there
Exactly.
any other issues that we need to tackle, Ken, in this passage? Are there any? And I know we've tried to compact this into a very small period of time, but we've laid author, we've laid context, we've laid the issue out, we've laid the perspective that is not Augustinian. We've laid it back onto it. Is there anything else? Is there a specific trip up point that we need to be aware of in this passage, a specific word or phrase that we ought to have our radar up for?
Well, I think you hit it at the beginning, Mark. It's that term dead faith, and it's been transferred to mean false erroneously. That's the wrong view. It means it's actually dead. It's useless in the New Testament sense of useless, where the other texts show it. No
Yeah,
place else says false. It comes from Augustan. So if you understand the context, it's sandwiched between judgment of the Christian at the Bema, standing before Christ, and that dead faith is not false. It just needs to be uplifted for intimacy with God. You have it. Those are the
there,
key elements.
there it is. There it is. Ken, I really appreciate you bringing the cookies to the lower shelf. That's marvelous, and I thank you that we didn't have to repeat the phrase of your article. That's some pretty heady stuff up there. uh, my guest today has been Dr. Ken Wilson. He has given us a beautiful, beautiful contextual look at James chapter 2, perhaps the most difficult passage for us to deal with in all the New Testament. And Ken, I thank you for opening my eyes to some new perspectives. I knew the fundamental view, but you've really couched it well for me to be able to now take it and understand what James was, who his audience was, what he was trying to say, and actually begin to begin to apply that, because it's every Christian's desire to have a deeper intimacy, and if that deeper intimacy can be one that is done by bolstering my faith with good works, then I'm all for it. That's a marvelous call to believers, for that intimacy with the Lord. Ken, thank you for spending time with us. Thank you all for joining us here on Grace Cafe today. Hopefully this has been edifying and has lifted you up, has given you some new perspective on a very difficult passage. We're going to tackle some more with Dr. Ken Wilson next week. Thank you for joining us. We look forward to having you then.